Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons Sarah Turner and Justin Harper. The podcast takes a considerable amount of work, so we really do appreciate everyone's contribution. You can support us too at patreon.com/it's not just in your head. For as little as $3, you can get access to our Discord community where hosts Ikoi, Hero and myself host weekly live discussions. So come join us. Please do rate us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on social media. We're on Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode or the podcast in general, then email itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. And this week's random call out goes to patron Karen Buckley. This week, psychotherapist Harriet, Fraad and substance abuse counsellor Ikoi Hero talked to economist and author Rodrigo Aguilera, author of The Glass Half Empty, Debunking the Myth of Progress in the 21st Century. Rodrigo is a Mexican-born, London-based economist who has worked for the Economist Intelligence Unit, and his writings have appeared in the Huffington Post and on the blog of the London School of Economics.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
We can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
I guess you identify these new optimists, and I wondered as a beginning of all of this, like, you know, maybe who they are and what they believe and maybe why they're wrong.
Yeah, so ironically, I wasn't familiar with many of them before I started writing the book. I mean, I was familiar with the main one, which is Steven Pinker. I think when everyone hears this kind of neo-optimism or however you want to call it, they think immediately of Steven Pinker. Really, it was an article that I read in The Guardian by Oliver Berkman. I don't know if you're familiar with.
Yeah, I want to get him on the podcast one day as well.
Yeah, no, he's really good. And I saw an article. I read an article. It was a long read, and he kind of described this ecosystem, and it includes some other people like Hans Rosling, who's kind of this sort of very glitzy kind of TED Talk type, thought leader, that kind. And there's a few others who are broadly speaking libertarians, outright libertarians. Someone like Matt Ridley. Someone like what's his name? He's from the Cato Institute. The name escapes me. I need to reread my own book now. But broadly speaking, I would say there's two camps. There's a very kind of centrist camp that's pro status quo, just basically wants to continue the broad policy set that we see. In terms of politics, in terms of economics, because they see anything coming from the extremes as a threat. And then you have the libertarians who basically use this progress argument as a counter to the left. So they're more openly kind of anti-left. But then Pinker as well is very openly anti-left. I mean, he has a chapter in his last book, which basically he calls progressives, regressive, basically. So yeah, it's broadly speaking, it's an anti-left argument because it's really been the left who has been the most vocal in pointing out all the ways that the system has failed.
And yeah, because it's really interesting because there's numerous bits in the book where you talk about like change doesn't just have to be like small incremental things. A lot of the time change can be these huge things and it can be positive. But if you just listen to, Jordan Peterson is very famous for saying stuff like, everything has to be very small incremental change. You can't make big changes because then it's a disaster and we'll fall into barbarism and all that sort of stuff. And I guess the intellectual dark web lot sort of cross over a bit with these new optimists in some way because of the sort of alignment with the status quo.
Yeah, completely. I mean, you see, Jordan Peterson, I'm glad you bring it up because Jordan Peterson, of all these kind of IDW types, is the one who I think mostly like openly copies almost, ad verbatim some of the stuff that you hear Steven Pinker say. I remember his debate with Slavoj Žižek, and he definitely went on a rant that you could have copy pasted from something Steven Pinker would write. So that's, the usefulness of this discourse is that it basically amplifies a message that is, I would say, definitely much more appealing to right-wingers and centrists as well, which, at this point in human history, centrists are basically, closet right-wingers.
The new optimists then really believe in a certain kind of progress, right? That they essentially believe that where we are now is the best place we've ever been. And any criticism of it is sort of unfounded, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you described it pretty well earlier, a preference for very gradualist, incrementalist change, but nothing that really rocks the boat. And I think if you look through history, you'll notice that a lot of things have happened quite radically, both for the better and for the worse. And a good example of a historical change, quite recent one that happened quite radically, I would say, was in the 1980s, the way that Ronald Reagan in the US and Margaret Thatcher in the UK basically undid so much regulation, privatized, kind of basically shock therapy type policies on the economy. And centrists were fine with that. So at no point did they criticize. No, this is too sudden. This is too radical. So whenever you have radical change that kind of benefits the interest of the right, then you don't really hear much from these people. It's only when it's radical change that benefits, working people, ordinary people, that they seem to complain all the time about.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
It certainly is. And I was, after looking at your work, I was reading a recent study from Harvard that claimed that in spite of the fact that young people used to be pessimistic, they're now optimistic. But if you read the study, 71% of the people say they're depressed and 28% are considering suicide. So that's not so optimistic. I also thought of you because just in the last few days, the figures for economic progress have been released, and the United States economy has gone down by about 1% in the last 3 months around the whole Ukraine business, whereas the Russian economy and the Chinese economy have grown. So that the whole lie that this is all about progress and how we're hurting them and we are flourishing, it's just lies, creating a positivist image while we're actually not floating the boat. The boat is sinking. And on a mega level as well as on a smaller level. So your book really does highlight something that's important.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I would see it, I mean, I'm not really someone who makes much of, sort of quarterly or monthly economic results, because, one quarter doesn't really say what the trend is. The argument that I would give is simply, by the metrics that we use to judge economic progress, it might seem on paper that the world is doing better, but it's when you kind of look past that, and I think the best example, GDP has a lot of criticism, and I think it's quite criticism that's very well founded. Obviously you can't look at GDP without looking at inequality. There's the issue of wealth as well, which, wealth is even more unequally distributed than income, which is what GDP measures. But, there's one chapter in my book which I dedicate to the poverty statistics, because there's been a bit of a fetish by these people to use the international poverty line developed by the World Bank and make the claim that, well, there's less poverty now than at any point in human history. So things must be going in the right direction, right? Even if countries like the US are kind of wobbling there and have their own problems. And, to some extent, even Steven Pinker is not like a super, I mean, he is neoliberal, but he's not like libertarian, free market loving. I think there's some element of his kind of Canadian social conscience that he might still have. But, even those, and these people claim basically, well, the rest of the world is doing fine. People in Africa now have toilets, now have, refrigerators, etc. And, if you look at the poverty, and I have a chapter where I discuss the problems with the international poverty line and how it doesn't really measure, I would say, a level of a standard of living that I think is commensurate to what we can provide. You know what I mean? Like,
yes.
And it's still a level, that poverty line, which is $190 a day in purchasing power terms, which, contrary to what many people think, that's not an exchange rate. That's not what they earn if you translated it to dollars. It basically means surviving in the US in 2011, which is usually the year they compare, on $190 a day. And I think if you lived in the US in 2011 with $190 a day, you would struggle pretty badly. Borderline starvation. So what about the people who earn, $2 a day or $3 a day? What's really a level of income that you can lead a decent life in? And if you talk to a lot of development experts, they will tell you that the poverty line needs to be much higher, at least $5 a day. Some even call for 10 or more. So and the question really becomes, we have all this technology. We sort of know how to solve a lot of development issues. Why can't we do it? Like, what is stopping us from doing it? And there's a concept called the sort of the moral egregiousness of poverty, that a lower poverty rate today is more morally egregious than a higher poverty level 100 years ago, because now we have the tools to be close to eliminating it. So, I think that's the way that I would see this.
I think that's really important, because I think one of the things they don't want to look at is the problems of capitalism, where profit über alles, profit overall, no matter who you impoverish. And those are the things that are coming up around America's biggest employers. Walmart, that has a food stamp office in the front of the office to help people survive while they work at Walmart. Walmart, Amazon, fast food, and call centers, all of which leave people desperate. And so, there's a real problem when robots were supposed to be able to work like humans, and humans are being worked like robots in the interests of profit, at least in the United States. And that is truly scary, because also at the same time as they're being worked horribly, they're also poor. And so poverty is increasing while work conditions are deteriorating, and it's frightening. And although I am not a great fan of authoritarian Chinese leaders, they have gotten 880 million of their people out of poverty, and their new offensive, their new sort of frontier is supposed to be common prosperity. So on that measure, the right-wingers are not looking good. And I wondered how you react to that.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's the case to be made that in a country like the US, with its level of income and wealth, anyone who works, 8 hours a day should not be in poverty. I mean, there's no excuse for that. No one should be forced to work 2 jobs or rely on food stamps or anything of the sort. I mean, it's a country wealthy and developed enough that, insofar as you work enough, you should be able to afford the basic things that you can, a house, a car, or whatever you need to get by in life. With regards to China, I mean, the Chinese development story is quite incredible. Obviously, as you mentioned, you have to put that into the context of, balancing out the authoritarian elements of that. I'm also not a fan of Chinese authoritarianism in any way. I think the takeaway from China is and I mentioned this in the book. I have a table in the book where I mentioned the 10 points of the Washington Consensus, which was basically the framework for all the neoliberal policies imposed or voluntarily adopted by a lot of Latin American, a lot of third world countries in the 90s and 2000s, and China pretty much violated all 10 of them. Maybe 1 or 2 points they sort of partly adapted to, but most of the others they developed exactly the opposite way that was the recipe that was given by the West on how these countries should develop. And I'm a firm believer in the idea that these countries should not have followed the Washington Consensus. In many cases, they had no choice because they had suffered horrible economic crisis in the 80s or 90s. Mexico is a good example of this. I'm from Mexico, for anyone hearing this who doesn't know where I'm from. But it became sort of a fad. It became the trend. It became the policies that were taken as definitive, and they haven't worked. They genuinely haven't worked. The countries that have gotten out of reached first, the very few, I should add, that have reached first world status in the last couple of decades. And, you can count them with the fingers in one hand. South Korea, Taiwan, some other East Asian countries that maybe not first world, but kind of halfway there. They've all adopted elements that violate the Washington Consensus. They had industrial policy. They had, state-driven development to some extent. So those types of policies are very hard to achieve nowadays because you have, for example, international trade agreements that prohibit control intellectual property, and copying technology has been a way in which a lot of these countries developed in the 60s and 70s when you didn't have these rules. So the system seems designed to keep countries from developing, and it's only been countries like China that have gone against the flow that have managed to do so. There's a book by a German economist, Isabella Weber, called How China Escaped Shock Therapy. I haven't read it, but I've read very good things, and probably you'll get a better idea of how they did that.
Well, is the Washington Consensus then a sort of roadmap for subservience?
Yeah, I mean, the Washington Consensus was basically a kind of framework developed at the era of peak neoliberalism in the late 80s and early 90s for countries, especially countries that had been affected by some form of economic crisis in the 80s, to emerge from that crisis. And it basically had, privatization, deregulation. There were 1 or 2 points that were kind of okay-ish. But I mean, a lot of these countries also were perhaps a bit too tightly controlled. I mean, Mexico, for example, should definitely have liberalized a bit, in the decades before our 80s crisis, but not to the extent that happened. So, this was the official kind of World Bank roadmap for poor countries to emerge from poverty, and they haven't.
It failed,
So one of the things that, I recall in the conversation about the Washington Consensus was United States kind of being very open about the huge mistake they made with Japan. In terms of Japan emerged from World War II, becoming one of the largest economies, and that was a huge mistake on America's part that they should never repeat again.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of U.S. policymakers in the 80s thought that. This was a peak era of Japanese paranoia, like corporate paranoia.
Right. I remember that. Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if, I can't say, off the top of my head if I've heard them openly say it, but yeah, I mean, the whole point is to avoid competition. That is the strategy. The idea, for example, of, I'm quite big on industrial policy. Call me a bit retro in that sense, but the idea that countries should not have industrial policy is basically industrial policy, because it's industrial policy for the Western countries, because then they can compete pretty much unimpeded in most of the global South, because they won't have competitors in the global South. So yeah, I think there is a degree of deliberate intent in preventing these. I mean, I also don't think that it's in the interest of Western countries for the global South to be poor, or because, you know, more affluent societies will consume more, and they will consume more Western goods the more affluent they become. So it's a bit of a trade-off. You know, you want them kind of rich enough that they can buy our stuff, but not rich enough that then they can form their own companies that will compete with ours. So everything that you have seen in terms of how industrial policy has been refashioned kind of post-Washington consensus plays into that. And you see it in the trade agreements, because trade agreements today are mostly not about trade. You know, liberalizing trade. If these agreements were only about liberalizing trade, I actually would not be that against them. It's the fact that all these other things that are attached to them, you know, the intellectual property stuff, etc., that you know, just other elements that seem designed to favor the countries that are better equipped, you know, technologically, etc.
And yet, you know, the deal seems to have been, you get their cheap labor, they learn your technology. And I don't know how you can get their cheap labor without people learning their technology. That seems to be a contradiction for them.
Well, yeah.
Well, that's where the IP restrictions come in, right?
Yeah. I mean,
there was a chapter, wasn't there? Sorry, you mentioned it various times about like the HIV, AIDS, and developing medicines related to that, and how there was an IP sort of war over that sort of stuff, and that it was by, you know, again, capitalists being capitalists didn't really want to share sort of medical progress they had made with other developing countries. Am I remembering that right, or am I having a stroke?
No, you are. I mean, I did include that in one chapter.
Yeah. And then it echoed with COVID-19, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
I was just about to say,
Yeah, I mean, the AIDS thing was quite disgusting, because you can count the number of people who could have been saved if you had, you know, the generic antiretrovirals or whatever it's called. The name escapes me. You know, you could have had these widely distributed many years before they actually were. And the same thing happened with COVID. And, you know, the main fear is obviously, you know, you have this new fancy mRNA technology, and you're going to give it to, or even not the mRNA, because the AstraZeneca vaccine was the one that was going to be originally distributed without patent protection, but just generally an advanced vaccine to any vaccine maker around the world that could make it. Well, that's going to increase the technological sophistication of those vaccine makers. And 20 years down the line, they'll be competing with your vaccines, 20, 30, whatever. So that's what you don't want. The whole point of this is that this technology should not be shared with other countries that can then compete with you.
The whole thing boils down to profit over everything. And so if you can't make a profit, let people die. Seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, and you do make the point in your book that, you know, you have a right to be anxious and depressed at the state of the world, right? But just as I don't know, maybe this has some value, but I thought before we go any further, it might be worth saying something positive, if there are positives, sort of steel manning the idea of liberal democracy and or capitalism before it gets sort of pulled apart a bit further, because you do sort of offer that up in various points. You say, well, look, you know, there is some good that came from these ways of doing things in the world, and from what I can recall, one of them is ultimately just sort of materials, right? Like we're materially richer than we have ever been in any point in history, right? The productive capacity. And Yeah, you talk about that sort of push and pull with liberalism and democracy. I don't know if you sort of wanted to do some sort of brief summary of the positives.
Yeah, I mean, I have to protest that you're making me say good things about capitalism. But,
yeah, I was just thinking about we. We have become richer. Who's we?
I mean,
well, I'm sat here with a laptop and a phone and a microphone. It's like, come on, like, somebody's got dicked for all of this stuff. Like I see that, like, totally. But at the same time, it's like this stuff exists, and that is maybe just a freak result of the way things panned out.
I mean, the material progress bit exists. There's no, you can't really deny that we're better off now than we were 200 years ago. And that's a point that Pinker loves to make. And I don't want to seem like I'm just echoing him with no reason. But, this is a point that could also have been made 200 years ago, before capitalism was really developed, when most countries were still, broadly speaking, kind of mercantilist or only proto-capitalist. And I make a point in my book that a lot of people, for example, in Britain, when they were debating the Corn Laws, were giving arguments that were fundamentally, very Steven Pinkerish about mercantilism.
Right.
The country had expanded its production, its trade, its manufactures, all the way up to like the early 19th century. We don't need to liberalize anymore. And then they realized that they did, and the country became even more prosperous, I guess. Right. A lot of the thing that has benefited capitalism, I think, well, obviously the idea that we needed some kind of material progress to really get out of the backwardness that had characterized most of humanity throughout most of the time, I think is undeniable,
As in like monarchies and stuff.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people perhaps overestimate the degree to which capitalism is responsible for that, and not actually technology as well, because technology expanded at a rate in the 18th and 19th century, or certain key technologies that provided a better material standard of living, that it just so happened to have occurred during capitalism does not necessarily mean that it wouldn't have happened, because a lot of these were invented still when we were still in kind of a mercantilist environment. But, the victories, I think, that were achieved in terms of prosperity also had to do with kind of the social struggles that happened in the 19th century, the labor movement, the suffragettes, etc. It's always been a fight against liberalism and capitalism, but some of those victories have been have basically changed humanity for the better. I would say. There's, if you look at the trajectory of income in Britain, for example, when capitalism began in Britain, like average incomes fell just because a lot of people were plunged into destitution because the new factory jobs were much worse pay, people's health deteriorated, etc. But then once the labor movement started kind of gaining momentum, income started improving because they managed to fight against the capitalists and earn some key wins. So it's always been, and that is my complaint about liberalism, really. I mean, I'm openly socialist. I'm not. I don't consider myself a liberal, and the reason is because I just think it's a very incomplete project. I think that liberalism did very good things in terms of opening us up to democracy and giving us a lot of civil liberties that we didn't have. But then it didn't do much on the economic sphere. You know what I mean? We still basically live half of our lives in mini dictatorships, mini totalitarian dictatorships, which is our job.
Workplace. Yeah.
Right.
That chapter, you give that example about the sort of North and South Korea thing, I thought was brilliant.
Yeah, and I mean, when you see it that way, when you, I mean, I think all of us have probably worked in a job where you realize, like, I have no rights here. I have
yes,
right, and like the stupidity paradox that you mentioned also.
And for me, like, actually, this is a funny anecdote, because I used to work for the Economist intelligence unit, which is part of the Economist, and it really was the Economist that turned me into a socialist. Just because it was just so badly managed, and you just felt that there was nothing you can do against any of this. So I've always been left leaning. I've characterize myself for most of my adult life as a social democrat, but then after working for the Economist, I went full on socialist.
Yeah, it's fascinating because you have that bit where you're talking about an article from the Economist where someone was sort of praising the likes of Amazon and that the best companies are run by enlightened dictators, and that it was said, I assume, like sort of like slightly lighthearted, but kind of serious, right? Like this idea that, as you point out in your chapter, it's like, imagine you live in South Korea, but every day you have to go to North Korea, and, they control you from 9 to 5. And that is a lot of the time, that's what work is, that you don't have autonomy. You don't have a democracy there. You don't have power to shape things. You just have to get through it. And I thought the sort of assassination of corporate culture was, completely on point. That the best way to survive is to be competent, but just shut up. That the corporate culture ultimately promotes, as you put it, servile incompetence. And I think, and you make the point earlier in the book that the limited liability company was like the mid-19th century when that's formed, and since then, structurally, what has actually changed?
Yeah,
right?
Not much.
Not much.
All the innovations in corporate structures kind of happened in the 19th century, and since then we're left with an institution that dominates every single, is the dominant form of economic production in the world, but hasn't really evolved.
And like you said, they're not the best. They're not the best vehicles for making decisions either, right? You give the example of Kodak not embracing digital photography, Blockbuster not caring about Netflix. It's like maybe in a co-op or employee-owned business, the people on the ground would be saying, we really should think about this. But because you have a sort of, a dictatorship, that the people at the top are the ones making the decisions.
Right.
You see some of
they're not responsive.
Yeah. So one example that I always give with this is that horrible Pepsi ad, with what's her name?
Kendall Jenner.
Kendall Jenner. And you see this ad, and it's so, like, when I saw it, I was just cracking up at how utterly insensitive it is. I mean, it's hilarious in its complete lack of sensibility, And you wonder how on earth a company like Pepsi, $1 million, probably $1 billion company,
billions.
How did this pass through the chain of command? You know what I mean? Unless you want to argue that they did it deliberately to just gain notoriety, which I don't understand why Pepsi would need that. But, you see some companies make some absolutely awful decisions that you realize this wasn't one person. This was a lot of people. There was a chain of command. And, maybe the executives higher up are genuinely stupid and don't realize why that's a bad decision. Maybe they overruled the people under them, but more likely it's the people under them that just felt that they had no say. They felt they would suffer some kind of fallout if they did dare say something. So it's exactly like bad decisions under communist regimes.
Right.
It's basically kind of its own set of apparatchiks and nomenclatura in these institutions. That I refuse to believe that this is the most efficient form of organizing productive activity that we as a human species can think of.
I think that's why the Democracy at Work movement for co-ops says that if you have a co-op-based economy, you avoid excesses on both the right and the authoritarian right and the authoritarian left, which does make sense, I think. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of worker co-ops, obviously. And I think, if your only policy is really, moving towards an economy dominated by worker ownership, that is sort of the baseline for being a socialist. You know what I mean? Because you are changing the basic institution of productive activity. Co-ops are not perfect. There's a lot of criticism to be made that sometimes they don't live up to their promise, or maybe not as democratic as you would want them to be. But still, all this criticism pales compared to the criticism that you can make to capitalist corporations. So it's like, I would much rather live in a system that is imperfect, but still much better than the one that we have now. And I feel that a lot of critics of worker co-ops focus on these criticisms and these limitations, and then just automatically discard them. And I think that's patently unfair, because we don't destroy capitalism just because an Enron or a Lehman Brothers existed. You know what I mean? And we can find many, many more examples beyond Enron and Lehman Brothers. So this is definitely, I do definitely think one of the great proposals that both Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders had was this idea that a certain percentage of company ownership was going to be given to workers. I think Corbyn asked for 10%, over 10. I mean, this is like, I remember the Financial Times going absolutely crazy about the fact that he proposed this. And it was basically like, oh my God, he's nationalizing everything. It's going to destroy every corporation in Britain. It's only 10% over 10 years. And I think Bernie's was 20%, 2% per year. And that would be, I would say, absolutely groundbreaking. I would love to see.
It would be.
Any government on earth start a policy of 10%, 20% of worker ownership, and see how things change. Because that 10, 20% is going to be workers on the board. It's going to be workers having a voice in how a company operates. And I think you will end up with companies that are fundamentally more efficient than they are now and more fair.
I also think that worker-owned isn't enough. It should be worker-run as well. Something like Mondragon, which is so successful, that huge worker co-op community in Spain, where workers actually run it. They don't just have shares. I think that would be the most important thing to ensure the democratic economic process.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think they go hand in hand. I mean, if you have worker ownership, you will inevitably end up with worker management as well. Not necessarily the other way around, because you can have a system like Germany's co-determination system, where you have some degree of worker management of a company, even though they don't have ownership. So, but I think they would go hand in hand. And
yes,
this would
need to be.
The likelihood that a worker-owned Pepsi would produce a Kendall Jenner ad like that would, I think, be very, very low.
In Italy, that whole province of Emilia-Romagna, they have tried to destroy this and failed because it's so popular. But when any business closes, the workers in that business can get 3 years of their salaries from the government if they form a worker co-op. And that's been enormously successful because they have. And they've tried to rescind it and failed.
Yeah, that was another proposal from the Corbyn campaign. It was the right of what's it called, the right of refusal or something like that.
Yeah,
that any company that wanted to close down or wanted to change hands would first have to allow a takeover by workers, and the government would presumably lend them the money if they couldn't find it elsewhere. I mean, yeah, I think this makes a lot of sense. I mean, obviously, not every company should necessarily, if a company is failing because it's badly, bad product, badly run, whatever, maybe it doesn't make sense. But, ending the mergers and acquisitions industry would not necessarily be a bad thing. And especially when you have the more kind of rapacious forms of these activities, like private equity. Where in many cases they're not interested at all in improving that company at all. They just want to, squeeze it out of everything for their own benefit.
Yeah, from your book, like, you make the point that employee-owned businesses often outperform capitalist companies. There's evidence that workers become more politically engaged as a result of being involved in employee-owned business. So there's a potentially self-reinforcing positive cycle. And there's also, obviously, once you feel like you've got autonomy in your job, well, who's to say, or who knows what the sort of mental health repercussions are. But when you don't have it, anxiety, depression, there was a few others that you listed that all came about. Now, I thought, but one graph that I thought was particularly damning was how when union membership went down, inequality shot up, and it all just, surprise, surprise, everything's connected to everything else. Yeah, and if you're spending a huge amount of your time, your life in a workplace that is just where you have no control over everything, then everything else starts to fall apart around that as well. So I think as far as a sort of direction of travel, the worker co-op, the worker employee-owned thing makes all kinds of sense. And like you said, it's not perfect. There's going to be problems. Humans are still humans. You're going to still have run-ins with people, and it's going to be difficult. But ultimately, you end up in a slightly better place.
Yeah, and I think it should be something that should be an ongoing experiment. I mean, I think the evidence that we have now is that worker co-ops pretty much exist in almost every industry somewhere in the world. Not always on the same scale. There's a lot of criticism that, like, it might work for small businesses, but it won't work with a giant multinational. I mean, I'm not quite sure that criticism holds. I mean, there are large co-op firms. I mean, in the UK, John Lewis, for example. And like I said, they all have their problems. John Lewis also has this. I think their CEO is a Tory. I'm not quite sure. Maybe not. Mondragon also has had some considerable criticism, but by and large, this is what we should be. This harks back to the moment where sort of the late mercantilist era, where capitalism was being slowly developed. It wasn't imposed or invented one day. Adam Smith didn't publish The Wealth of Nations, and the next day everyone was capitalist. That's not how it worked.
Right.
Right.
And the same thing with here. I mean, we're not going to move out of capitalism from one moment to the next. It's going to be small steps, and I think the issue of worker ownership is one that I think should be an ongoing experiment. We should be encouraging it. We should be seeing how companies in different industries, companies in different with different scales, manage to operate under these new structures. And if they are successful, then we should, undoubtedly continue. But to some degree, it has to come from above. Like, it has to be a government that sets it as a deliberate policy, like Corbyn and Bernie did. It's not going to happen organically at all, because the one of the biggest debates, and I touch upon it in the book. Obviously, this is not something that I would spend a chapter writing on, but is why there are no. I mean, if the argument is true that worker co-ops are more efficient, the evidence seems that at least they're efficient enough. And there's a lot of evidence that, for example, they're much more resilient. So when you have an economic crisis, they're less likely to fire workers because they're more likely to kind of sort of collectively suffer in favor of keeping their jobs at some point, and even countries do it, like Germany kind of did that during the financial crisis. They lowered working hours and cut pay, but with the guarantee that these people would still be employed. So they're more resilient. But on the broader point of why there aren't any more, if they are indeed that successful, it's because really there's just no incentive for the people putting up the capital to set up a worker co-op, because they're gonna receive less returns. So that's kind of obvious. And in a way, it's sort of like you would have governments. I mean, if there weren't any, if democracy had not been properly established as sort of the dominant political model, most countries would be authoritarian.
Right.
Because it's in the interest of the ruling class to have more power.
Yes.
Right. So the same with companies. It's the interest of economic elites to have as much power as they can. It's only when we move forward towards governments forcefully imposing this change, that eventually we can reach a kind of critical mass in which enough companies are worker owned that this becomes the new standard.
I guess there's a whole bunch of things that I think we could explore, and maybe this is sort of rewinding a bit, but you talked about, it sort of made me laugh really, depressive realism. This idea that we have to shield ourselves from reality with optimistic self-delusion.
Yeah.
And you made the point that actual cancer patients lived longer if they were optimistic. So to some degree you go, well, is it a delusion if it actually shapes reality, right? But it's this idea of that we're hardwired for optimism. And I guess when you're in an environment that constantly is sort of letting you down, that starts to fade, and then that starts to you have all the mental health repercussions that come with that. But you make the point that pessimism doesn't have to lead to nihilism, or sort of on an individual level. But you make the point that on a larger scale, society is better at it. It serves its people better if it's pessimistic and not optimistic. And I just wondered if you wanted to sort of explore that idea a bit.
Yeah, I think a lot of these people, and Jordan Peterson, I think, is a good example of this, is someone who, I mean, my basic position is what works for the individual doesn't necessarily work for society. I think I explicitly say that in the book. And, someone like Jordan Peterson basically becomes a kind of self-help guru and then translates that self-help into actual, economic policy. And I think that's incredibly, stupid and unrealistic. He can be perhaps a great psychologist. I mean, I have no doubt that perhaps he has helped many people escape depression and on an individual level. But then the same recipe of make your bed every day before criticizing capitalism. He takes that sort of individual self-help and translates it on a societal level, and that's not what's going to work, because you can't change in a country of the US, for example, 300 million people. Changing the way that they think and behave and act is going to be kind of impossible. It's much easier to just pass a policy. So I disagree with that view, and I do think that as societies we should be realistic about how things are and what we've been able to achieve. I mean, what I write in the book is basically we should see things. We should see progress as not what we've achieved, but what we can reasonably claim we could have achieved. And if you look at it from that perspective, most countries have really fallen short of that ideal. But in the sense of kind of back to this issue of depressive realism, I mean, that chapter where I write about that is one where I criticize something that these new optimists do all the time, which is basically they claim that everyone who doesn't believe in that kind of progress narrative is irrational. And they do this all the time. And that kind of infuriates me. And centrists, especially the centrists, they love to do that. They love to present themselves as being, the uber rational, evidence-based types. And everyone else, whether it's far right or far left, are over emotional, irrational, etc. And that's just pure BS, because they're exactly the same. And the Steven Pinker and the others like Hans Rosling especially Hans Rosling, I would say even more than or as much as Pinker, have played this game of the book Factfulness is basically, the idea behind it is just like, well, the reason that you don't realize how well we're doing is because you're irrational. you listen to only the bad news, but you never listen to the good news, because the media doesn't ever present the good news. So this is a cognitive bias, and this is so they play this game, and I think it's just it's ridiculous. So I agree that there are aspects of in which they are right, in that we're perhaps overly pessimistic about certain things, and that is based to some degree on a level of irrationality. But then optimism, as I described in that chapter, can also be hugely rational as well. I mean, and the best example of this is the stock market.
That's right.
If you a really good economics book that I love is Irrational Exuberance. That was a book written by it's Bob Shiller. Yeah, Robert Shiller. So he's an economist, mostly doing behavioral finance things, and that book is really good because it explains sort of the irrationality of the .com bubble, and then later that also sort of translated itself to the subprime crisis. So please don't tell me that optimism is entirely rational when you have these people basically crashing the entire world economy on the basis of optimism.
Yeah, you could look at Peterson as crashing when we had that long nervous breakdown about telling everyone telling everyone else how emotionally
Jordan
off they
Peterson's
were.
recent history of substance abuse and mental health issues really makes me wonder how anyone can listen to him. Any sort of seriousness. I mean, the guy is just
exactly
off.
One of the things that I kept coming back to when I was reading the book, and it's funny that you mentioned a Kurt Cobain quote, the one about being stupid or happy.
Oh yeah. By the way, if did anyone notice that all the chapters in my book are named after rock songs?
No, I didn't.
No, I did not. Yeah. I did not. But one of the things about especially American therapy is how much this Pinker-esque optimism has infused mental health treatment.
Yeah.
And some of the basic philosophies and approaches to mental health treatment. For example, the way that CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is often, deployed in therapy spaces. Is often about kind of like, you're being irrational. There's what's wrong with you is like, your internal self-talk dialogue, right? That's what's making you depressed. Let's ignore all this context outside of you. The more you work to a certain degree with like really seriously impoverished client base, which I often did, it is kind of almost like this grotesque egregiousness of, because one aspect of optimism is like this, and the school of, I know like Stanford had this whole like, psychology of happiness thing. There is this, huge pressure for people to constantly perform and express gratitude in this country.
Barbara Ehrenreich wrote a good book called Bright-Sided about how she had cancer and all these therapists and people were trying to say what a blessing it was. It's not so great to have cancer.
Of course.
Isn't there another one, Smile or Die, which is about that? Because it's interesting because, you say in the book, cancer patients will live longer or whatever if they're more optimistic, but that's also exactly the same problem, right? It's like you have to be optimistic. Like, why aren't you, got to stay up if you want to live? It's so fucked.
Right. It's so delusional. And Emily Gwendelsberger, who we hope to have on this program, I'm working on that, wrote a very good book about America's horrible employment, where everyone is on the clock, monitored at every second and driven. And it's called On the Clock, What Low Wage Work Did to Me and How It Drives America Insane. Because it's very carefully documented how anxious it is, how anxious people are because they're hounded every second. And it's even solved a mystery for me. Americans are growing shorter. every year, whereas people in the Netherlands and Scandinavia are growing taller. They're now the tallest people in the world. And I wondered why that is. And then I realized because she talks about what anxiety does to your immune system, how it suppresses it. And that includes your growth hormones, which is one of the reasons we're getting smaller, because we're so anxious that all other systems are turning off to cope with the danger that we face on our jobs. Wow. And your work really contributes to that, not to the anxiety, but to understanding and stopping it.
But this is a point you make in your book, right? Which is that, you know, you can solve political problems with economic solutions. And obviously the co-op thing, the worker-owned thing is one of those things that governments can do if they were, you know, pressured into doing it. But you need that sort of political...
I mean, I think that the two things is one, the more control you have over your life, and two, the less things that you have to worry about, you know, healthcare, things like that. It's huge. Like, I mean, you know, there's many problems with Britain, but the fact that the NHS still exists, the fact that, you know, I know that tomorrow I can get cancer, and have it treated without going bankrupt is one thing one less thing I have to worry about. You know what I mean? And if I was living in the US or Mexico, even where I don't have this guarantee either, I would be more worried. You know that this could.
Of course, and you should be.
Yeah.
That's even worse.
Yeah.
That you should be more worried. Americans are now who need penicillin because they have an infection are getting fish mox, which is amoxicillin for fish, because that they can get without having to pay for a doctor and pay for a prescription. It's cheaper at the pet store. That's terrible.
Yeah, I mean, the horror stories from American healthcare are too many to list.
Yeah, legion.
Well, you know, this is one of the things that you talked about, which was really interesting about the Scandinavian countries, this idea that they are just as unequal as, you know, America or Britain, but it's the redistribution is the thing that...
Right, the social.
Yeah, you know, and that's the political will, that's the culture.
Yeah, and that's actually a really shocking statistic. I mean, I was not aware of that until quite recently, like right before writing that book. And it's shocking just how, you know, even in big, heavy welfare states, capitalism by nature is incredibly unequal. You know, it's only through the welfare state that these countries have anything resembling, you know, an egalitarian society. And if it so happens that any government wants to get rid of the welfare state, then they'll end up just as unequal as the US. I mean, there's nothing really stopping that. And, you know, Britain is a great example of a country. I mean, Britain's welfare state was never as developed as Scandinavia's, but it was still much more comprehensive before Thatcher came to power. So,
yeah. Okay, so the other thing that I thought was sort of fascinating was this idea of the state has a monopoly on violence, and in theory that has pacified the citizens to some degree, because Pinker makes the point that you're less likely to die by someone else's hand, right?
mm-hmm.
But you did,
well, not in the US.
Well, he's sort of making the point in your book. You're sort of making the point that, you know, this in a way is a sleight of hand of Pinker's, because whilst the violence internally might have died down, and maybe it hasn't in the States, that ultimately countries, states fight each other with just as much violence as they ever have, if not more.
Yeah, so there was a kind of a switch between the type of violence that you would see. I mean, if you lived in, and I give the example of Oxford in England, having the homicide rate in 13,000 something, similar to El Salvador or Honduras. You know, medieval times were brutal, and you were highly likely, well, not highly likely, but, you know, the risk of dying from someone else killing you, you know, highway robbers or whatever, you know, vagrants and brigands, whatever, was quite high. It was a tough time to live in. But then you sort of had a consolidation of the state as the monopoly of violence once nation states kind of developed in the 16,000s. And then it became more an issue of interstate warfare. And the centuries after, I would say probably, the 30 Years' War and the period that followed is really when Europe becomes quite violent in terms of warfare. And then obviously the Second World War, the First and Second World Wars was sort of, proportionally perhaps not, but still, yeah. And then after the two world wars, it sort of gets better. But even there were a lot of wars during the Cold War that were very violent, and wars that we often assume were just kind of minor regional conflicts, but proportionally they were horrific. And the Korean War is a good example of that. Vietnam as well. I mean, we're talking about wars where more than 1 million people died, and mostly civilians. So the Pinker's sleight of hand as well is that he looks at the number of people who die from warfare in the 21st century, compares that with 200 years before, and then says, look, the world is less violent. And yeah, if you're just comparing the numbers of how many people, what's the odds that you're going to die from state violence or warfare today? Yeah, it's lower than it ever was. But he still sort of forgets that the world, and I think this is one of the big points in my book that seems to have been vindicated by the war in Ukraine, is that you can still have conflicts that are quite, very violent. I mean, this is by far the most violent land war in Europe since World War II. And ones that have a risk of getting worse. And the risk has always been nuclear. And, you can't just discard the fact that these things can happen, which I think he does to some extent. I think also the risk is, what is this risk to the global order as well, to general peace and security? Conflicts today also are very, less people die, but you have more issues with refugees and displacement. And, the Ukraine war is a great example. I mean, in the matter of days, you had millions of Ukrainians who had to flee to other countries. And this can be catastrophic in the case of Syria. You have countries that basically are depopulating. And the reason that we don't have as many deaths is really because we are in a situation where you have more efficient ways of civil administration, things like that. Not because war itself is any less violent.
Also, you have a threat of nuclear total murder now, which you can see in the Ukraine, in the demands that the kind of background of nukes that's in the background, which would obliterate the entire population. So that's another factor in modern warfare, the danger to the entire planet.
Yeah, of course. I mean, these existential risks exist. Perhaps we fearmonger a bit more about these existential risks than one that is happening day by day, which is climate change, which is sort of the elephant in the room in my book that I do discuss towards the end, but it's kind of there throughout the whole book. That is really, really the threat that we face as a species, that nothing that Pinker writes about is going to ever resolve. But I just find him to be a bit too callous about discounting the threat of things like nuclear war or this idea. I think this idea that there is this kind of rule. I hate this term. I've always hated it. This rules-based world order, which really has never existed. I mean, we still live in a world where the powerful do what they want. We've seen this, the US invading Iraq. No one was able to stop that, despite the fact that we had all the institutions in the world to supposedly prevent war, but they were useless. Now we have Russia invading Ukraine. Again, the entire world powerless to stop that. So, the strong still attempt to dominate the weak. Thankfully, and they succeed. I mean, the US succeeded in Iraq. Thankfully, Russia's not succeeding against Ukraine. But yeah, this is still the world we live in.
And this is exactly why pessimism on the sort of institutional society level is important, because it's like the weather forecast. It's for trying to foresee a storm that's coming your way. And if you're all just sort of blind optimists, like, nah, everything's going to be fine, then it doesn't, it's not good for sort of ultimately the baseline survival, right?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people were caught a bit unprepared with this war, just because, again, if you were believing the sort of Pinker logic that a land war in Europe just couldn't happen because, one of them hadn't really happened for so long, then it can't happen now. And you just saw people completely dismiss the possibility that, this guy just put almost 250,000 troops next to another country's border. Is he just not going to use them?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think to some degree there was an element of kind of people not wanting it to happen. I mean, there were a lot of people on the left who were just basically refusing to admit that Putin would do something like that, and also people on the right. But I think this had to be taken more serious than it was.
It had to be, and also there was partly this optimism allowed the United States and NATO to circle Russia with hostile bases.
Well, I'll be honest. I'm not a big fan of that argument. I'm not a fan of the sort of NATO pushed Russia into doing this. I mean,
no, it's an element that people thought wouldn't have a consequence. Well, that's all I'm talking about. That there is this positivity that, of course, the Russians won't do anything about it when they're surrounded and they have a 1,500-mile border with Ukraine. Well, they could have thought when the United States was threatened by Cuba having a base 90 miles from home, we risk World War III in order to dismantle that base. You think they'll just stay there? Is that positive thinking? That's silly positive thinking, that there won't be a result of whatever you do.
I mean, there is a degree, I think, in which a lot of elements of post-Cold War policy were perhaps mismanaged, but to some extent, a person like Putin, I think, even from very early on, became pretty clear that he was the type of person to not follow that imaginary rules-based order. That, I mean, I think
exactly.
the optimism was believing that Russia would suddenly at least have the facade of being part of that order.
That's right, and that the U.S. would too. That all of these countries would. They won't, and it's evident in our history that none of them do.
Yeah, I mean. Yeah, it's true. I mean, that is kind of the point that I make in chapter, I think it's chapter 8, which is just about warfare. And yeah, until we develop real institutions that can actually constrain the powerful countries, but the ones that we have now are useless. I mean, the Security Council is useless because of the veto that 5 countries have. So it can't really do it can never do anything, because there's really going to be just 2 types of aggression in this world: Western aggression and Russian or Chinese aggression. And either side is going to immediately,
they're both there.
It was going to immediately veto what the other sides do. And if it's not them, it's going to be countries that are allied to them, like Israel, right? So, so you have an institution that's just basically not designed to do what it's supposed to do, which is to prevent warfare. And then even if it did, I mean, is it really going to stop a country like the US or Russia or China? No. I just don't think it would ever do, even if you didn't have that veto. They would just do it anyway. I mean, the day that China decides to retake Taiwan, no one's going to stop them. Like, absolutely no one's going to stop them. Just like nothing stopped Russia from doing what it's doing now.
Right.
Yeah, but the sort of the general emphasis is that institutions, even in this case that they're failing because no one can stop them, that institutions are the bedrock for change, right? That's where a rules-based system gets implemented, right? In an institution, it's like where rules are set and how things are done. And that's sort of ultimately where you see some sort of progress being made, or that's where there should be a focus.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm personally quite a fan of strengthening institutions to be better able to do what they should intend to do. And it's also, partly it's institutions, partially it's also norms. The sort of unwritten institutions, the unwritten rules of human behavior or state behavior matter a lot. And these are also influenced by institutions. It's sort of the cultural institutions, I would say. They matter a lot. And we've seen a lot of deterioration in the last couple of years, unfortunately, which is why I think, the status quo of things is much more worrying than what Steven Pinker would say. And I mean, the best example of this is that book that came out that made quite a splash during the early Trump era, which was When Democracies Die. I mean, and the argument fundamentally there was not so much that Trump was going to destroy institutions, but rather that he was going to destroy the norms of democracy. And to some extent, Republicans in the U.S. have been destroying them since the era of Newt Gingrich back in the 90s.
That's right.
And it seems to just be getting worse and worse and worse. So these things matter. And I mean, one of the, I think, better arguments in favor of being pessimistic is just seeing how across the world these norms that sustain political democracy are just being upended. And as left wingers, as socialists, I think we care about the economic aspects of how humanity is structured, and this is central to the view of how we want to generate positive change. But I mean, I think we all can agree that democracy is a good thing. It's something that
I think the tension is that you have to be deluded enough. You have to have optimistic bias yourself, that you feel well enough in yourself that you feel like you can make a difference, and that you can make a difference with a whole bunch of other people together to push, for institutional change, for example. Yeah. And that's where the rub is, right? It's like, if you live in an environment that is constantly wearing you down, then how can you believe in change? Like you have to have that sort of, the delusion, the belief that you can do stuff, because that's the only way things can change, right?
Yeah, and one example of I think what we're talking about that I think has really disturbed me quite a lot, and I'm sure Liam will agree with me, being British. The Partygate saga, with Boris Johnson, which
broke the rules. Yeah,
which is, I mean, he broke rules. So literally broke
his
rules that he set. But I think the fundamental problem is not so much that he broke the rules. I think the fundamental problem is that he is the leader of a party that seems to not care about that. And that's where you see, the institutional aspect is that he broke the rules, but then the norms aspect is the fact that his party doesn't care about it. That at any other point in British political history, they would have immediately had a no confidence vote on him, because this is just appalling, from a rules perspective and from a moral perspective. So, what's the state of the Tory party if they don't do that? If they're happy keeping a guy who basically can do whatever he wants, and that's how democracy dies. To quote the title of the book.
Right. That's really
the quote
true.
from. You said there's a quote that's common in Mexico: "If you don't cheat, you don't get ahead."
Yeah.
And it's like, that's what those ways that culture changes on the ground between people. It's like, once you create a culture like the Boris Johnson and his crew have, what are the repercussions for everyone else?
Yeah, I mean, Mexico is a great example of a country that really tries to create institutions because it believes that with the institutions alone, things change. But then they realize that all the toxic political culture and norms that exist simply find ways of getting around those rules. That's why I'm not like 100% a believer that just institutions alone change things, because I'm from a country where we've done so much institution building in the last 20, especially since we turned to democracy in 2000, and yet hardly anything has changed.
Right. There's a thing in is it Denmark? Apologies for any listeners. Is it Jonte's law, where it basically is a cultural thing that just means you're not very special, and it's the thing that keeps everyone grounded, right? Like, you're not better than me, I'm not better than you. Let's all, contribute to some sort of a thing called society. But obviously, it has negative repercussions as well, because people, I guess, maybe. Maybe there's benefits to both things. Jonte's law keeps you grounded, but maybe it doesn't make you feel like you can sort of do much. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear from listeners.
Well, one of the things that's really impressed me vis-a-vis that is Chris Smalls, who is a spokesperson for the Amazon Labor Union, that was told they could never have a chance. It's an enormous, second richest man in the world and with total control, and they won. And when he's being interviewed, they said, "Did you think you could do it?" He said, "I knew I could do it. I knew I could get the people behind me." And so that on the one hand, you can accuse him of false positive thinking. On the other hand, he'd worked there 5 years. He knew that with between 150 and 100% turnover, everybody wasn't happy on that job. And he knew how to reach them. And so he made something happen that was thought impossible, which is really impressive and shows a way and a hope all over labor in the United States, which is increasingly hopeful about changing things.
Yeah, and those small victories add up, and I'm really quite excited about what's going on with Starbucks and Amazon,
and the nurses union.
That is that's impressive. In a country like the U.S., that is very impressive.
And even in a country with a corrupt labor movement that has been right in bed with the State Department, these are independent unions that are happening. And the flight attendants union, which is very progressive with Sarah Nelson, and the nurses union that won on a strike about patient to nurse ratios to give better care. It's being transformed in a way that we wouldn't have imagined 40 years ago. So that's very positive.
In the academia episode where I interviewed various people who have been through it or in academia, one guy, Austin, was talking about how he was talking about this case where someone was going to have their student loan written off because of some reason, some sort of medical reason, I think. But basically, the American government stepped in and made sure that didn't happen because they didn't want, and this is that whole thing of like just these little kindles, like if anything, any kindling happens and the fire starts, that they're really
afraid.
Scared, right? So they are signs of hope.
Yes.
Because it's just an example of the fear that exists just with one case.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons that I'm when I wrote that book, the 2019 election in Britain hadn't yet happened, and then obviously the 2020 election in the US either. And I mean the fact that neither Bernie nor Corbyn won was, I think we need to really understand the dimension of just how this has set back, the ability to create positive change, especially in the US, because to have someone who's a declared socialist become president of the US would open the floodgates not just to positive change in the US. And, the US is a country where a lot of this change probably would not have materialized for various reasons, the Supreme Court knocking down. So I think we would have had to kind of temper our expectations. But even just the discourse, even just the things that he probably could do, would make a massive change for countries like mine, because
yes,
a country like Mexico is still sort of with this, it's there is no alternative besides neoliberalism. You will not find more kind of hardcore market-loving people than in Latin America, and I suspect other parts of the global South, because we've been indoctrinated to some extent, to an extent that probably even in the West hasn't happened. So just the fact that you would have, the most capitalist country on earth get a socialist president would just open the floodgates for a lot of people to think differently, and a lot of people to reimagine the kind of policies that they could pursue in countries like mine. Corbyn as well, to a lesser extent. I mean, Britain is still, I think, a country that, even though it's obviously not as big as the US and influential, but it's still a country where people are broadly aware of what goes on to some extent. So I think it would have mattered a lot.
I think it would have.
I'm a huge fan of Bernie. There's a lot of things about Corbyn that I didn't like. But there's no question whatsoever that, a Corbyn Labour Party was infinitely superior to any form of Tory government that exists now.
But also, I don't think people could avoid the fact that both of those candidates lost because their own parties stabbed them in the back. The right-wing elements of their parties destroyed them.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but here's an element, I think, of kind of you have to be ruthless politically as well. Like, you have to know that you are going to be, in the sights not only of your rivals in other parties, but also from the conservative elements or centrist elements in your own.
Yes,
like Bernie Sanders could have been much more aggressive against Biden.
He could have
in the debates, which I think he was far too gracious. Corbyn, I think, also could have been much more aggressive in like prime minister's questions, etc. In addition to other failings that he had. I mean, I definitely think he didn't handle the anti-Semitism issue very well. So he, his sort of kind of tanky-ish tendencies as well, with probably not. I mean, a lot of the criticism on Corbyn has obviously been exaggerated, but I think there is a lot of truth to some of the kind of dodgier aspects of it. And then they needed to, he could have just disowned all of that. He could have just said, maybe I accidentally did hang out with IRA and Hamas leaders. They're not my friends. But then he just had to say that. He literally just had to say that.
That's right. Yeah. And Bernie could have known what was coming instead of trusting the Democratic Party not to stab him in the back.
Yeah, totally.
Just as a sort of, I'm aware that we're coming up to time, but I would be interested to hear your thoughts as an economist, what you make of modern monetary theory. Is it balls or is it real?
That's a very good question. And my answer is I've been meaning to read more of it. I'll be honest. I'm quite sympathetic to it. What I've heard about it seems relatively consistent, but I feel I need to get more into the nitty-gritty, the actual macro theory of it to make a decision. So off the top, I don't want to endorse something that I'm not that knowledgeable of, because I think it would be pretty disingenuous on my part. But at the same time, I do confess that I am sympathetic to some of the ideas, and I definitely think the idea that, I mean, this should not be a controversial statement. The idea that debt isn't really that big of a problem in countries that can print their own currency. I think you don't even need to be an advocate of MMA to support that idea. And that is kind of one of the premises of it. I don't know. I would have to see if some of the other elements of it are too outlandish.
Yeah, because the sort of fundamental thing that I think has sort of cultural potency is because you see it everywhere. People are always like, how are we going to pay for X, Y, Z? Or that like, oh, we should be taxing blah, blah, blah so that we can pay for this. And MMT is just saying, tax money is just destroyed. Tax money doesn't fund anything. The decision to fund things starts at the beginning of the process, which is like, how much money do we make for X, Y, Z thing?
Right.
And if that's true, then that is huge, because suddenly, particularly living in Britain the last decade or so, if ever you watch, the TV Question Time, like everyone, maybe rightly so, becomes a mini economist. And they're like, well, we can't pay for that. We can't do this, blah, 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 blah. And because, tax, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, suddenly all that shit just goes out the window and it just becomes about sort of political will or political choice. Because if you have the population prepared to do the work, then it doesn't matter.
Yeah, but one of the things that really infuriates me, and I don't have a solution to how we can kind of overcome this, is just how easy those talking points for the right just become, the conventional wisdom. You know what I mean? Like you will still hear it time after time. How do we pay for this? How do we pay for this?
Yeah.
And you just never, you never see this with, the U.S. military budget. How do you pay for that? It's ludicrous.
Right. But there's also like this, general consensus among society that in the United States, I mean, I live in the military town, I live right next to one of the biggest Marine bases in San Diego. And there is a huge general consensus that like military is a necessary institutional existence for this country. I mean,
the military, if Ukraine didn't have a military, they wouldn't exist anymore. You know what I mean?
Right.
I mean, I think there is a reasonable level of spending in defense that every country probably, wants to have. I think the idea that abolish the military is a bit too outlandish. It's just not based on reality. That's, you might see it as a headline of a Jacobin article, but it's, it's not going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah.
But, obviously you look at the deficient. I mean, if you are conscious about debt and deficits, then your concern should be on what you're spending so much on that is, not producing you any social gains, which would be the military, versus other types of spending like healthcare, education, whatever. Yeah. But on the issue of like whether you can spend on both, there was a tweet that I saw the other day, which was like, we shouldn't be spending all that money on arming Ukraine when we don't have healthcare or we don't have education, whatever. It's like, and someone replied, well, we could actually spend on both. Take the MMT mindset. Well, yeah, you can still arm Ukraine. You can still spend on healthcare. But I mean, I really, really, it pains me that we can't, from the left, create talking points that are so universally adopted as just this. And these people at this point, they don't even believe it. They know it. When you see your average right wing pundit in the US, or the Nick Ferraris or Ian Dales in Britain, who also just always more Good Morning Britain or any of these silly talk shows, how can they just they know that that's a stupid talking point. They know that it's not based on any sort of economic logic, but it just works. It's so effective because it immediately forces your opponent to have to justify all that spending.
But then also it is Goebbels' principle that if you repeat something often enough, people think it's true. And that's what's happened in the US, that spends 9 times more than any other country and has never been invaded. Well, and has invaded many others. It's the often repeated that gets to be taken as truth. And that's dangerous. Now, I guess I'm sorry to throw in the last word and then leave, but I have to leave. And so thank you so much. Thank you very much for an exciting discussion and book.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm glad you like the book.
Just kind of going back to the military, I guess a huge part of like, why people have a certain, aside from like, like you said, the need for defense, there, it is one of the biggest, college, like way to college for a lot of people. It is a jobs program for a huge part of the working class.
Yeah, I mean, I
yeah. So what I just wanted to say was that, a lot of those things are founded. We don't have, an alternative, for the working class. Like that's part of why like policing, is one of the few jobs, high paying jobs that people can get without a degree.
Yeah, but it's kind of sad that you use the military as a source of social mobility. When you're in a country that
absolutely.
Wealthy. I mean, I have friends. I finished high school in the U.S., so like that's where the accent comes from. Not a very Mexican accent. And I had friends who joined the military, and some of them served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and it was a way for to not have to pay college tuition.
Right.
And you realize, well, you shouldn't put people in the line of fire from.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with you there. It's one of I think the reason that the military gets such a high approval from the general population is that there is no other alternative to these, like there is no real alternative to reliably get college funding, or, even like a long-term career that's stable.
Yeah. I mean, I think in most countries, the military is probably, if you had to rank what are the most approved institutions, it's probably one of the high. I mean, definitely in Mexico, it's one of the most well regarded institutions, despite the fact that we have no shortage of human rights violations from the war on the cartels.
Or drugs. Yeah, war on drugs.
To a degree, it's a bit of a sort of Stockholm syndrome view of them. You know what I mean?
Right. And so like a lot of times, yeah, like it rather than, talking about oftentimes how bad the military is, because that just kind of shuts people down. It's really important to talk about what alternatives we should be developing.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, I think in a country like the US, the issue of how much is spent on the military and as well as other forms of security, the defund the police. I don't think that's been the smartest slogan ever, but the fact of the matter is, US police get way more money than they need. And it's all, if you are working on this premise that there is a limited amount of resources, if you're not in an MMT government, if you're from the premise that there's limited amount of resources, then there's plenty of other areas where you can devote those resources.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think
absolutely.
And that's a key point in the book, really, is just you're saying is like, is this really the best we can do? Don't accept, you don't have to accept what is. Like, the whole title of the book, The Glass Half Empty, it's like you should be saying, well, who took it?
Yeah, who took the other
half of all the water? Like it could be fuller. It's really interesting because I can't quite remember when I read the book. I'm pretty sure I got it when it first came out, and I think when it came out was during the pandemic, or was it?
I mean,
the year before that.
I had the really terrible luck of publishing a book in March 2020.
Right.
The worst month that I could publish a book. So yeah.
Well, if it's any consolation, I'm pretty sure that I did buy it when it first came out, and
that is good.
Very excited for its release. I was tracking up for. I can't remember how I came across it, but I was like, I was really looking forward to reading it, and it was great. And then working on this podcast, I was like, this would be, this would be a great thing to talk about.
Yeah, and I think 2 years later, post-pandemic, post-Ukraine war, a lot of the ideas in that book have been vindicated.
Yeah.
I don't really talk
absolutely.
about I don't talk about pandemics in the book, but Steven Pinker also downplayed the possibility of a pandemic in Enlightenment Now pretty badly.
Right. Right. He was just like, oh, vaccines. We'll just develop vaccines and it'll be deployed properly. And
yeah, he thought it was going to happen. He gave the parallel was the swine flu epidemic.
Right.
That was clearly the worst that things could get.
Yeah, the thing is though, there is a bit in the book where you are talking about you're quoting someone else, but the sort of four horsemen of leveling or whatever it is. This idea that in a system that stays stable in the current sort of setup of things, that you have a bunch of people who just extract rents, like things aren't getting made, they're just extracting value. And then you have more and more inequality in a supposedly stable system. And the only thing that changes that stability, if I remember, is war.
Pandemics.
And pandemics was one of the four, alongside, the state just failing and or some sort of civil war, or I can't remember quite what the fourth one was. But the point is, you did mention pandemics; it was in there, so kind of spooky.
Well, the irony is that there's even more inequality now. So what does it say that throughout human history, pandemics have been the great levelers of
here's
income,
the thing,
and now this time around it didn't.
But it's like, again, it's like all this stuff. The story isn't over, and there's this element of like I think that there is a huge amount of anger in this country that has not yet found a place to be released, because loads of people's loved ones have been killed and they didn't have to die. And that has not been resolved in any sort of shape. And something is going to come out of this sort of suffering, this tragedy. And it might be positive or it might be really regressive. But there's my dumb prediction for the future. Lol.
Well, I mean, hopefully you're right, but then the other risk is that the type of capitalism that we have now allows people just sort of enough amenities and enough ways to enjoy life that they'll just not pay attention to the way that they're screwed over. And I mean, this reminds me of the game Cyberpunk 2077. I don't know if any of you play games, but it's this basically, cyberpunk, all cyberpunk is kind of this corporate dystopia, futuristic corporate dystopia, where everything is ruled by giant corporations and, people live horribly. But throughout the game, you just see like people kind of having beers on the street, hanging out. And it's you play the game and you're like, I kind of want to live here. You know what I mean? and then at the same time, you're like, well, you probably don't want to live here. So I don't know. I'm really worried about that.
It's interesting because I think there's a couple of things. One is Ikoi to some degree. I think probably your experiences with substance abuse, that the people you're seeing, your clients, sort of demonstrate that, right? Like stuff is just screwed up around them, and drugs are a way of finding some kind of relief, escape.
Yeah, relief, escape, and it's a coping mechanism.
So yeah, it's completely possible as a future. There's also another thing though, which is just in terms of this is a side, maybe I can edit it out, whatever. But yeah, we did there's a couple of episodes I can send you. We did a couple on video games and the sort of the effects they have and sort of some of the ideology that plays out when you play them. It's really sort of an interesting topic.
Yeah, that sounds quite interesting.
Send there's a couple I can send. But I think I do wonder sometimes though, like, so, and this is a side, and again, I might edit out because it's just sort of rambling maybe. But, if I order something from Amazon and I'm aware that there's gross exploitation involved in that whole supply chain, is part of the buzz of buying something, it lets you be like a little dictator, king or queen or whatever, just for a momentary time. Like, all these people are going to run around and bring me this thing, that is that part of the sort of dark pleasure in partaking in all of this sort of stuff. And I sort of wonder with the video game thing, like, do you get in the cyberpunk, do you get to experience what it is like to be superior? You get to be Elon Musk, like a simulated Elon Musk. It's like, look at all these people just hanging around trying to get their cheap thrills, whilst I'm sort of the ascending in this sort of tech world.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, in a sense, that kind of is the plot of the game, sort of to kind of rise among the criminal underworld. So yeah. I mean, with the I mean, the whole gig economy thing, and sort of the easy access that you have to purchase things on Amazon. And you get things, I mean, I think Amazon would not be nearly the horrible company that it would be if it didn't have like 1-day shipping.
Yeah.
That's right. Really what makes people work so hard in their work. Like, the exploitation in the work in their warehouses is just because you have to have this kind of insane schedule of shipping things on the same day, like this, I don't know, same hour practically that someone orders something.
Right.
If you just had regular 3-4 day, in Britain, usually, I guess the average is like 3 days, that you can get anything anywhere in the country. If you just had that, I don't think you would have that degree of exploitation. And to some extent, the idea that you deserve that, you know what I mean? Because I know a lot of people that get Amazon Prime, and then they start with the 1-day shipping thing, and now they can't live without it. And it's like, yeah, you could live without it. You spend most of your life waiting 3 days for something to arrive.
Well,
actually, I mean, it used to be like 2 to 3 weeks before you got something mail order.
Yeah, well, maybe, I mean, in the US, it's always been a bit long because it's a bigger country, but in Britain, it's always been like 3-4 days that you would get something, and then the worst part is you get things that are like, you can just buy anything online, even if it costs like £2, and you're like, well, what was the shipping cost of this? Like, what are you really, the sort of human effort to bring you this? Is it worth it? Is it? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, you do make the point in the book that efficiency gains get eaten up by demand, right? And you end up back in square one. And I think the Amazon thing is the prime example of that. Prime, lol. Just that idea of, we can get it to you in 1 day, then just becomes the norm. And then you're, like you say, running around trying to maintain that is causing all kinds of terrible shit. And also, it reminds me of that my new favorite quote: what people say, what people do, and what people say they do are entirely different things.
Yeah, of course.
And I feel like a piece of shit because I ordered something off Amazon just the other day, turned up today. It's like, I'm just a terrible human being.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of guilt as well. When you sort of, but then you also think, I mean, I do my best effort to, like, if something is slightly more expensive elsewhere, I don't care. I'll just buy it elsewhere. But then sometimes something's so cheap on Amazon, you just can't resist, and you end up buying it. But then also the other thing is, like, what's your guarantee that anywhere else that you buy something isn't generating that type of exploitation? You can think, it's more noble to buy from, the store in the corner or a small business. But, often small businesses just treat their employees just as bad as the big ones, if not worse, and with worse pay. So right. What's your guarantee? Like, you can't escape the whole, there's no ethical consumption in capitalism, period. And you can't you can't spend the time doing the due diligence of knowing whether the place that you shop in is ethical or not.
Right. Right. My only way around that was, I refused to pay for Prime. So and it's also where I live. One of the things about, like, Amazon 1-day delivery is that if you live outside a pretty narrow window, of location, you don't get things in a day.
Right.
I live in San Diego County, which is, I'm basically 45 miles from San Diego. So I'm not that rural, right? I'm not like in middle of nowhere. But even where I live, it rarely has ever been one day delivery for me. And for like actually the majority of the county, and a lot of times, when people tell me like, oh yeah, I don't get things in one day, it's like, why do you keep paying for Prime? That's just money down the drain. That's not benefiting you in any way.
And then also, like, if you shop in Amazon, you're like, okay, well, I'm not going to shop. I'm not going to buy directly from Amazon. I'm going to buy from a seller on Amazon, so I know that I'm giving it to, a small business or a human being. But then you actually realize that most of Amazon's profits, or a substantial part of the profits that they do on retail, is actually through their,
their independent seller
exactly,
network,
because they charge them extra for warehouse storage, for shipping, etc. They force them to buy so it's worse. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well, and it's also making it difficult. There was a whole thing on Amazon and how it's making it difficult for like independent resellers to not go through the Amazon route.
Yeah, because you're screwed either way. If you're not through Amazon, then you won't have the exposure when someone does the search on Google or whatever. But then once you're on Amazon, then you're subject to all these other insane costs. And people don't understand that. The idea that Amazon is not a monopoly in the traditional sense. You know what I mean? Because monopolies eventually exist to raise prices, and Amazon doesn't really do that. It's more a monopsony than it is a monopoly.
Right, and that's one of the points in the book as well. It's just that it's actually regulated markets that have competition, because without the regulation, one person or one entity starts to dominate, and then the winner takes all.
Yeah, and especially in anything related to tech, especially anything related to platforms. And Yanis Varoufakis has a very good. He's been talking a lot about techno. I kind of hate him now for his Ukraine takes, to be honest.
Right. I haven't heard him.
He's gone sort of full NATO full Russia apologist, but
really interesting.
Disguised Russia apologist. But he has he was pitching a good theory. He calls it techno feudalism, because these platforms basically are not capitalistic. They're more feudalistic. In the sense of how they operate with, all the other sellers that operate on their platform. They extract some rent for them, they impose certain costs on them, and that's how they make money. And you can't really exist without being part of that platform. So these are systems that more resemble feudalism than they do resemble capitalism in the traditional sense. And I think he makes a very good case. I think it's very true.
But I think we've probably used up enough of your time. But that was awesome. Like, I really enjoyed talking about all that stuff with you.
Yeah, this was a very good conversation.
Yeah, and if you're working on a new book or you ever decide, you're welcome to come back on and have a chat whenever.
Definitely, I actually am working on book number 2. So
awesome.
So we'll see. It's on Mexico.
Oh, cool.
Been meaning to write a book on Mexico for quite some time now, so I think it's appropriate.
Now, I have a quick question for you, since you are from there and living there right now. Do you have a good recommendation on like the economics surrounding the drug war in Mexico?
The economics of it, I don't know. I haven't read much about the drug war, to be honest, because honestly, I find it a bit depressing.
Understandable.
There's an author called Ian Grillo, who wrote a book that's gotten really good reviews, and he's written a lot about the drug war. So in terms of reading stuff on the drug war in English, I guess that would be a good look. The economics of the drug war, I would say, it's really, and in Mexico, at least, I mean, there's an element of the economics in terms of the trafficking and how the market moves in the U.S. But to be honest, a lot of the dynamics in Mexico that generate the violence is really territorial. It's really about, who controls which cities, who controls which traffic routes, who controls which ports. And then it's just a complete chaos in the sense that it's like a worm that you cut. Each cartel is like a worm that gets cut every so often, and then you end up with 2 worms, and then you cut those and you end up with 4 worms. And honestly, nowadays, there's only really 2 cartels that are kind of large and semi-cohesive, which is the Sinaloa cartel and the what's called the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. But then all the others are just remnants of all the other old cartels that used to exist. And so you have this map of just complete chaos. And as long as I mean, we're at a point, I think, that the narco problem isn't just about the economics of it, and it isn't just about the politics and security aspects of it. It's really cultural now, and that's what depresses me the most. That a lot of people, because they don't see a future and this might be relevant, to the stuff that we've been talking about, just in case you think of editing this bit out, which is the idea that there's no future in, you will get a crappy job stacking shelves at a Walmart in some, third-rate Mexican city, get an absolutely horrifically low pay, and yet be flooded by all these views on what you should be, the consumer culture, being wealthy, being affluent. In Mexico as well, might sound crazy if you haven't been to Mexico, but also being white, because there is a massive degree of racial inequality in Mexico. If you're indigenous, if you're dark-skinned, you're probably going to be poor. If you're a white Mexican, you're probably going to be rich. So it's all this aspirational culture that is completely out of hand. And I think a lot of people decide, well, you know what? The life expectancy of a foot soldier in a drug cartel is not huge, but hey, for a couple of years, I'm going to be living it. So I'll be able to go to I will get the respect. I will be able to go to fancy nightclubs and order whiskey. I will get the girls. I will get, the clothes, and, who cares if I end up getting chopped up with a machete at some point? It'll be worth it. And it's really depressing. That is just, I think, a scale of societal nihilism that it's really hard to, Mexico really needs urgently a massive socioeconomic revolution, like some form of minimum income, basic income, something to just immediately cut that link between, I wouldn't say poverty, because not all of them are poor, but just precariousness and crime.
Right.
And sadly, we have a left-wing government that isn't doing anything of the sort. I'm a massive critic. I'm a leftist, I'm a socialist, but I'm a massive critic of López Obrador. I think he's been a complete incompetent. And I think he hasn't solved any of the problems that he was voted for.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that's, but that's also to a certain degree pretty... the cultural aspect is not just a Mexican one. There is definitely an American aspect to that as well, especially, in terms of drug dealing and why people, get into it is often because, they have no other prospects financially to make, any kind of significant stability. So, people are going to reasonably go for short-term gain. in that case. So yeah, that is something that the U.S. and Mexico shares in some degree.
Yeah,
I see it now, and it's funny because I wondered it before, actually. And Justice for All, of course, I definitely was like, oh, is that just a regular Master of Puppets, and then The Evil That Men Do is Iron Maiden? So it's like,
yeah.
And now, like, looking at, all your chapters, I was like, where is Rain and Blood?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's the bonus chapter.
Seasons of the Abyss would have fit very nicely in describing some of these chapters.
Massive thank you, as always, to our VIP patrons, Rebecca Johns, Sheena Bilmus, Alexander Lashley, Jennifer Cox, Seamus O'Connell, Alex Placito, and Bruce Rogers Vaughan.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on WBAI at 2:30 EST on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.